I would recommend that people ask this question: how can I create more freedom in my own life? Because when we ask ourselves a question, we will typically get an answer. So if we actually sit in a quiet place with ourselves, maybe during meditation or just a moment of introspection, what activities can I implement into my life that would give me a greater sense of freedom? Because it's not necessarily just the visceral or the external sense of freedom, meaning like a free amount of time. That's one form of freedom, but ultimate freedom is a sense of freedom. It's personal sovereignty. It's sovereignty over one's life. It's the sense that I can choose what I want to do.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back to the show. Prepare for a big paradigm shift around the way you think about freedom after this episode. You are not going to think about freedom the same way again, I promise you. We have Ronnie Landis talking to us today. He is a leading expert in holistic health, nutrition, and human potential. His work ranges from exploring the fringes of health sciences and food-based nutrition to a deep passion for helping people overcome long-held mental and emotional roadblocks so they can experience every area of their life at their full potential. Ronnie is a public speaker, a teacher, and a published author of multiple books. He hosts 2 podcasts as well, and I really enjoyed my conversation with him. He's going to be sharing with us today this paradox: how uncompromising discipline in how we schedule our day-to-day lives actually results in the freedom to show up as our best selves. He explains why we often define freedom incorrectly, and we're going to learn in this episode how to break through our pain threshold in order to create the structure our highest self secretly craves. So if you've been wondering how to balance structure and freedom in your own life and your daily schedule, this is a must listen to episode. Before we dive in, I quickly want to remind you to support the podcast by making a purchase on SivanaSpirit.com. Meditation comes up several times today in my conversation with Ronnie, and I just wanted to remind all of you that SivanaSpirit.com has everything you need to enhance your meditation practice, whether it's beautiful mala beads or singing bowls, statues, or incense. All of these things are available at SivanaSpirit.com. It helps support the podcast. And in addition, you can use that discount code, remember, podcast30, for 30% off anything your heart desires. All right, now let's jump into this very special episode. Ronnie, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So I have to ask you, do you have a yoga practice? That was my first question for you today.
Yeah, I do. It's not as integrated as a consistent basis as my workout routines have been. My whole life, I've been an athlete and a martial artist. So my physical movement practices change from time to time, and yoga is definitely part of it. It's not a everyday thing, but I definitely go into different postural positions as part of my stretching routine. And I love yoga. I love the philosophy of yoga. I love going to yoga class whenever I get the opportunity. So it's definitely in the mix.
That's wonderful to hear. Of course, I'm completely yoga obsessed, and it's one of the reasons I was so excited to bring you on the show for today's topic. As I mentioned, we're talking about how you, according to you, uncompromising discipline is actually freedom. And I want to hear from you about this. Before we jump in, it did remind me of the Yoga Sutras, which is why I wanted to ask you if you had a yoga practice. And it's great that you said you did love the philosophy. Sutra 2.4.6, Sthira Sukham Asunam. It's a really famous Yoga Sutra. Sivana listeners, I'm sure many of you know it. But Sthira means stability or strength. And Sukha is the counterpoint to that, right? It means ease or comfort. openness or flexibility. And then asana, of course, we're all familiar, most of us, with that word, is the actual postures themselves. And often it's actually translated as a pose or a seat. So literally, this sutra you can translate to mean yoga is a comfortable, steady seat. But the translation I offer in my teacher trainings and that I really love is this idea that the practice of yoga is finding the balance between strength and flexibility, or finding that balance between effort and ease. And I think this is something so many of us struggle with. I know I personally struggle with. It's like, kind of, when do you need to give yourself a kick in the butt and when do you need to have compassion, and how do those two things blend together to create a life that's fulfilled and moving forward? So again, this is why I was so excited to have you on the show, because I feel like I get asked this question all the time from students. It's like, how do I integrate discipline while also having freedom? And what you're saying is that uncompromising discipline is freedom. So being very strict with yourself is actually freedom. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's different ways to contextualize or interpret it, whether it's strict or it's uncompromising or it's non-negotiable. I think the words we use cast a spell, and each person is going to be affected differently by it. So you want to find the phrase that works best for you and your temperament and your kind of the way that you like to interact using words in reality. So using the word strict may not resonate with someone, but uncompromising or non-negotiable, or a different type of word that ultimately can translate as the same thing, but can invoke a different energy or a different feeling around it. Adaptability or flexibility may work for someone else. So ultimately the answer is yes, though. Like, ultimately, I was just on a podcast earlier talking about a similar concept, that when we fill our day with activities that are of our own design and we are directing the flow of our day, then there's an infinite amount of room and space for us to explore our own creativity. But if we don't fill our day with our own pre-directed activities, and we don't design our day and we don't design our life the way that we choose, then ultimately we are going to be directed by the dictates of the world, the external world, external authorities, external responsibilities, obligations, and the demands ultimately of other people in the world around us. And that's just kind of the paradox that we live in, because we think of freedom, oftentimes people think of freedom as in being free of obligation or being free of responsibility, but that isn't actually freedom to me at all. It's a bit of a paradox, and I find that the wisdom and the truth in things is somewhere in the center point of the paradox. And if we're able to mentally hold two opposing perspectives or two diametrically opposed points of view, then somewhere in that middle point is going to be the universal truth. And so, is responsibility the source of freedom, or is the absence of responsibility the source of freedom? I think it's somewhere in the middle. And for each person, it's going to be unique to their temperament. Some people are highly ambitious by nature. Those would be like very type A type of people. Even somebody that would get into yoga and become obsessed about it, and then they would do teacher training, and then it would become their life, and then they'd open up a chain of yoga studios or whatever their particular ambition or inspiration around that was, using yoga as a vehicle for their own creative urge. That to them could be a source of incredible freedom, because ultimately what it's doing is it's freeing them up to do what they want to do. And that's really what this comes down to. Was when I think of freedom, I think of the word free. And free is, we have the choice to be free to do whatever we want. And if we don't choose to do what we want to do, then we are freeing ourselves up of self-responsibility, and then we're becoming responsible in a certain sense. We can kind of unpack that as we go along, to basically do things that may not be self-directed or self-designed. Does that make sense?
I think so. I want to dig deep with you here because I think many people, or when you were describing the yoga obsessed person who's type A, I'm like raising my hand. I'm like, yes, that's me. That's me. And I have, for example, I have a lot of freedom in the sense that I run my own business, right? At the same time, there's a lot of things, and I think all listeners can relate to this, that I have to do each day, right? Like I had to be here at this time for us to record this episode. Maybe I, definitely was looking forward to it, but it's gorgeous out. Maybe I would have wanted to go for a run. I think for all of us, it's like, what is that interplay between scheduling our lives, right? Scheduling our tasks and also leaving space for us to just be able to do whatever we want to do intuitively, impulsively in the moment.
Well, if I may be so bold, I want to maybe pose a slight alternative perspective, which is you don't actually have to do any of that. You didn't have to do this interview with me. You didn't have to schedule it. You could have listened to the impulses in the moment and just, message me and say, hey, you know what? Something came up, can't do it. And then you could have acted on the impulses. And that could be seen as an interpretation of freedom. And in some sense it is, but ultimately you chose to do this with me. You chose to do, we all choose. This is the point. We all make choices every single day, but there's a little bit of a language barrier, I think, in just the way that sometimes we interpret this whole thing around discipline, responsibility, obligation. And then there's this whole other thing called freedom. And freedom for most people seems very elusive. It's like the idea of being on the beach and just sitting on the beach on vacation or something and not having any responsibilities whatsoever. And for a lot of people, that is their definition or their interpretation of freedom. And personally, I don't think that temporarily, in a vacation sense, maybe there's a little bit of freedom there. But when I think of freedom, I'm looking at how do I free this capacity of creativity within me? How do I free this thing inside of me that wants to create? And then when I come from that place, then I realize that it's not freedom of responsibility or freedom of obligation that I'm looking for. It's actually freeing something within me that wants to create my life. And so for you, in the example that you just gave, even though on the surface it may seem like, wow, there's a lot of responsibility, there's a lot of things that I have to do or maybe that I get to do in order to reach my goals, but maybe I'd rather be doing something else. I actually think there's a lot of freedom there. And how do we find freedom through discipline? Because that's the title of this show. Discipline, uncompromising discipline as a way to freedom. So let's unpack that. Let's go a little deeper into that. My feeling growing up as a martial artist, being highly disciplined, being very focused on accomplishing goals, one of the things that I realized was if I could structure my day and I could line up my day based on the hierarchy of my priorities and my values and what was most important to me, I could become more effective and efficient with my time, my energy, and what I put my time and energy into. And then I noticed that what ended up happening is that I had a lot more time in different pockets of my day to be more impulsive, to actually do things that maybe before I didn't feel like I could do, because ultimately the truth was without the discipline, without the outline, without the routine, I was scattered mentally and emotionally. It actually required me to get very disciplined in terms of what was most important to me, what were my goals, and lining that up in a structure. For example, waking up at 4:30 in the morning, going to the gym at 5 in the morning, doing my first workout. I had 3 workouts throughout the day. And I also was working a part-time job. So when someone hears that, they're probably like, wow, that feels overwhelming. How could you possibly have a balance in your life? And I was also in a relationship. So on the surface, that sounds pretty overwhelming to a lot of people. But if you actually get into it and you think logically, all I have to do is schedule my activities and stick to my schedule. And then I have all this other this other gray space in between the structure to do the other things I want to do. That's a good starting point for this conversation, for someone to understand the paradox of, like, they might be questioning, like you said, like, how does this work? How does discipline equal freedom? There's a lot of different ways we can go with this. One other thing I want to mention before I hand it back off to you is one of the big things we have to do is emotional discipline, because there's a lot of time and energy that gets sequestered to activities that actually waste a lot of time because we don't discipline our emotions. We don't discipline our disappointments, for example. And a lot of times we actually use energy and time that we could be creating the life that we desire by mulling over past disappointments and things that had happened to us, things that we kind of get caught up and entangled with. And it actually causes us to waste time and lose that freedom that we all desire.
I want to bring us into a practical example, because I think what you're sharing is super exciting. And it calls to mind to me, we've all heard of writers, for example, right, who are so disciplined. They get up and they write a certain number of pages every morning, if they're a novelist, for example. Or the example you shared, right, where you were training as a martial artist and you have that commitment to get up early and make it happen. And I love the idea that freedom is something we're unleashing, right? It's not like we just get to do whatever we want with our days. It's almost, I call this myself, when I talk about it, like parenting yourself a little bit, right? Because it's like, if you had a little kid, you could just let them do whatever they wanted all day and that would be freedom. But it's kind of like being that parent for yourself. You know, if you wake up at the same time each day and do your self-care activities, whatever those may be, and, you know, write your pages if it's a book you're working on, or do your podcast or whatever it is, if you have that structure laid out, it's sort of like you're setting yourself up for success. Just like you'd set your kid up for success so they could eat well, nap well, all of those kinds of things. Am I on the right track here?
100%. I mean, honestly, I think this is one of the most obvious kind of principles, but I do understand the need to unpack it, because it's not obvious to most people because of a lot of the ways that we've been brought up, and a lot of the things, you know, because most people aren't really living for themselves. You know, I think a lot of the people that listen to a podcast like this are into creating their own, designing their own life. And that's what we're talking about, because ultimately, one way or another, to function and contribute in our world and in society, we have to be part of something. You know, for example, people work jobs, and that requires structure, it requires discipline. You got to show up on time. You got to do certain things that you may or may not want to do to meet your goal. And for the goal for most people is the paycheck. But whatever the example is, ultimately what I want to get across is that the understanding that, you know, freedom is not aimlessness. Freedom is not about not having anything to do, right? It's the reason people, I feel, the reason people want nothing to do is because they're doing a lot of things they don't actually want to do. But when you design your life based on your hierarchy of priorities, meaning what is the most important thing to you? So I'll give you another example. I've authored multiple books. I've written about 6 books, and I've turned them in over about 6 years into 2 main books. And I'm constantly doing this. You know, for me, that's something that's very important for me. So I find a way to integrate that into my lifestyle. It ultimately is part of my lifestyle. And I find tremendous freedom in that, because if I'm super clear on what it is that I want to accomplish or what it is that I want to do, I start to structure everything in my life to create space or to create freedom, if you will, for, let's say, 2 hours a day. So if I'm looking at my day and I feel like, wow, I really just don't feel like I have a lot of time, or I need to shift things around, then I will start reprioritizing what I'm already doing to make space and freedom for that activity. And what I find is that when I start to do that, other areas of my life start to free themselves up. I start to find that when I'm focusing on my priorities and what's most important to me, and I'm making that a priority and I'm showing up for that every single day, there's other parts of my daily lifestyle that I find actually weren't as important as I thought they were, but they were just filling space because there was a part of my consciousness that was not being totally deliberate. It's almost like I just let that tendency or that relationship or that whatever, you fill in the blank for you, wherever this lands for whoever's listening. Oftentimes we have areas, little blind spots in our daily life that aren't necessarily part of our priority, but we kind of let it go. And it creates a little bit of, how do I say, what's the word I'm looking for? It squanders space and actually creates a little bit of a box. And that's where I feel like this whole thing around freedom, where people are seeking freedom, but they don't realize that if they just shift some things in their lifestyle, they shift some priorities, they refocus on what's really meaningful for them, and they commit themselves to that, again, uncompromising discipline, they are uncompromising about what's important to them and fully activating that in their daily life, they will find that other areas of their life start to open up because their priorities come into alignment.
It seems like step one is that you need to get clear on your definition of freedom. So I love that you've brought that up, because I agree. I think a lot of people think freedom is that unstructured. And it's like, no, really, that's a vacation, right? That's not freedom in your daily life. And then this idea that we've been talking about of structure, setting yourself up for success, mainly through perhaps routine. I want to ask you more about that. Like if, kind of having the same schedule every day or same schedule out this each week. I think we've all heard of really successful people who kind of have a rhythm to their life. They're doing the same thing every day. But before we talk about that, I feel like we need to answer the $1 million question, which is, what do you do, or what do you tell your clients to do when they've maybe set out this schedule, set out this structure, say it's to get up at 5 a.m. and write, and the alarm goes off at 4:50 and they don't want to get out of bed? Because we have those self-sabotaging voices that are saying, ugh, your book's never gonna get published anyway. Ugh, it's so warm in my bed. Ugh, the heater's broken today, so I should just stay curled up in a little ball, right? All of us experience resistance, even though we know, even if we buy into this idea that discipline is granting us this freedom and is the best, we still encounter it. Do you?
Yes, and it's interesting. I look from a health perspective. They say heart disease is the number one killer in the Western world, the number one reason for death. But I actually think it's something called excusitis. And this is kind of a term I coined a while back, and it's basically what you're talking about. I mean, there is going to be that resistance to change whenever we're trying to change pattern, a thought loop, an emotional tendency, especially if it requires physical movement, like going to the gym or taking a yoga class and making it a consistent routine, or writing a book, basically doing something that we are not used to doing consistently. There will 100% of the time be a resistance. And the resistance isn't a negative thing, but we tend to interpret it as a negative thing because it creates discomfort. And that's the trap. So if people can understand that little middle point, that transition point, that bridge between comfort and discomfort, that is the whole game right there. And if you can get into that this is what yoga teaches you through the asana practice, right? Like get into that discomfortable, that uncomfortable space, and you stay there as long as you can, and you focus on your breath, and you get comfortable with being uncomfortable. There's actually a tremendous amount of freedom in that. I mean, that in of itself, to me, is what the whole asana, the true meaning of the asana practice is really about, is finding freedom in uncomfortable circumstances. And so a whole conversation around resistance and moving through resistance really could be summed up in that type of example, and looking at your life, looking at what you want. So to be really direct about, answering your question, what I tell people, or what I'll walk people through, is a value determination process, because ultimately people will choose in favor of what they believe will get them where they want to be. So if somebody is not clear about where they want to be in their life, they're not clear about their goals, they haven't found the meaning in what they're doing, or how this is going to enrich their life, short-term and long-term, then somebody is probably going to hit the snooze button instead of wake up early and go to that yoga class, or get up early and write the book that's inside of them that's been kind of urging them for years, and they've just been putting the snooze button on their passion, on their creativity. Somebody is going to continue to do that until they get to a point where they what's the word I'm looking for? Well, basically what I just said, till they realize, or till they find out what's truly important to them, I guess. So if relaxing on the beach or sleeping in is more important than getting up and getting on the mission, as it were, or doing the thing that is calling you, even though it's uncomfortable, somebody is going to choose what they feel is going to give them the greatest pleasure over pain until they break that pleasure-pain cycle and they're willing to be uncomfortable, or they're willing to be comfortable in an uncomfortable transition.
I love the excuse-itis, and I want to share with the listeners, for myself personally, one thing I found helpful is really naming those voices inside my head that provide all those excuses, right? Because when I name them and observe them, I can kind of see how sneaky they are and how they just keep wanting to keep me in the same place, right? Because those voices in our head, I think, are very committed to things staying the way they are as opposed to changing or transforming. So, because again, it requires that transformation, whether we're talking about it in holding a different yoga pose or getting up at 4:50 in the morning, right? There's that pain, that discomfort before the reward, right? Do you have any other tips for folks, Ronnie?
It's an incredible conversation. I mean, I guess my tips or advice would be along the lines of, redefining what is important for you in your life. Like, I really feel one of the big issues in our world is that we're moving at such a fast pace, and we're getting so technologically attached and so aggressively focused on achieving. We oftentimes do not step back and actually look at the whole situation and look at our life as a whole, because our life as a whole is made up by the months and the days and the hours and the minutes that we're participating in this thing called life. And I really want to recommend to people that you really take an inventory of your life, take a mental inventory, the thoughts that I'm thinking, the thought loops, the stories, the ways that I'm thinking about my life and what's possible. Let me evaluate that. Are these stories in effect true, or are they stories that have been projected upon me since I was a little boy or little girl? And have I just taken these thought patterns on, and are they authentically mine, or am I operating from something someone else told me way back when? Let's take emotional inventory. How do I feel when I'm in an uncomfortable situation? Do I emotionally get stressed and then start binging on food to feed my emotional void, or do I get agitated, or whatever the case may be? Let me take emotional inventory of my day-to-day life, and then let me take inventory of my activities. Because if we're going to be talking about this whole, discipline equaling freedom, if we don't feel like we have freedom in the first place, then we really need to take inventory of, why is that? Well, let me take a look at my day and start to look at everything that I have going on a regular basis, or my month, for example, if you want to plan ahead. And then there might be some reinvention, some redesigning that needs to take place in terms of, how do I create this? This is the question I would have people ask themselves, because ultimately you, me, and anybody else, we can't do it for anybody else. All we can do is change ourselves, and then hopefully become a good role model for other people. So I would recommend that people ask this question: how can I create more freedom in my own life? Because when we ask ourselves a question, we will typically get an answer. So if we actually sit in a quiet place with ourselves, maybe during meditation or just a moment of introspection, what activities can I implement into my life that would give me a greater sense of freedom? Because it's not necessarily just the visceral or the external sense of freedom, meaning like a free amount of time. That's one form of freedom, but ultimate freedom is a sense of freedom. It's personal sovereignty. It's sovereignty over one's life. It's the sense that I can choose what I want to do, even though I may be super passionate about something. I may be working 16 hours a day. That doesn't look like freedom to one person, but if you know that you're choosing to do that and you're not in a victim state, meaning that you're not doing something you don't want to be doing, but you're actually fully engaged with life because you want to, there's incredible freedom in that kind of approach.
And this is where I think language, like we talked about before, is so important. A shift that I made, and I encourage everyone who takes my training in classes to make, is to change I have to I choose to, right? Because it's kind of like just like what we started with, right? I have to is that victim mindset. That's disempowering. The reality is we all have choice. Exactly. Like I could have canceled this interview today and, laid in my backyard in the sun, but that didn't make sense for me, right? Because my purpose is to interview you and share and try to create value for all our amazing listeners. I want to unpack a little bit more what you talked about also at the beginning with this idea of emotional discipline, because when we're thinking about the alarm going off at 4:50 in the morning or whatever it is, and those excuses that we mentioned, right? Is that what you sort of meant by emotional discipline? Because I think we all have had that experience of the alarm goes off and then the excusitis is kicking in, right? I'm too tired. It's snowing today, on and on and on. It's so interesting because this energy that could be just channeled towards like doing your workout right away, right? Or just hopping out of bed, that energy is now channeled towards the excuses, right? And one thing that I found really helpful, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, Ronnie, for myself personally, is putting things on autopilot. So for example, just going for a run every single morning, or doing the same Kundalini Kriya yoga class every single day, or following a training plan or outline where it's just like every day I know what to do. Things that help eliminate those excuses, like eliminate choice. So it's just, okay, voices, I hear you, but I'm just on autopilot. Like I'm just putting the sneakers on, right? Or I already know what yoga class I'm doing. It's already picked out. I'm just getting on the mat. I found that really helpful. Does that jive with everything you're talking about, or what other tips do you want to share?
No, 100%, because ultimately what you're saying is, I'm going to plan my next move. I'm going to plan my next day. And that's the whole key. So in a sense, you're putting on autopilot, but you're also engaging with it in order to put it on quote unquote autopilot. Being able to delegate certain activities that are not, let's say you run a business or something, there's going to be, or to have somebody edit this podcast, for example, it wouldn't make a lot of sense at some point in the journey for you to be doing all the editing work. I know that for my podcast, I have somebody edit. I have a certain chain of command of delegation, because it doesn't make any sense for me at this point to be doing that. That's not me being free. So there is effort. There is deliberate intentionality that goes along with creating freedom. It's not that freedom just lands on our lap. It's that we actually have to participate in freeing ourselves from the monotony, the mundane activities, or, maybe you don't want to call it mundane activities. Let's call it lower level activities that are not going to allow you to be fulfilled at the next level. And you have to plan for it. You have to plan for your day. That's why having a schedule, in following through on the schedule, by the way, it's not just having a schedule, it's actually doing what you said you're going to do on the schedule, is so important. And that's where this whole thing around uncompromising discipline, creating freedom, the rubber really meets the road, because the uncompromising discipline is what creates the possibility of freedom in the truest sense, in the sense that I'm coming from feeling free, being free to be yourself. Because the truth of the matter is, if we don't create if we don't, I almost want to use the word impose discipline upon ourselves, but if we don't act upon discipline, if we don't use a disciplined approach to life, then life will discipline us by other people. We still need to get by in the world. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, you're going to have to also be your own best employee and your own best employer. You have to play both roles. But if you don't want to do that, then you can forego responsibility and then give yourself to a job or something. And maybe that's somebody, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, but that's the other option in terms of, from the financial and obligation reality of the world that we live in, just to get by, just to make ends meet, so to speak, just to make just to cover the basic needs. We can either do it by creative design, or we can forego that and then leave it up to somebody else, which will then impose discipline upon ourselves. So one way or another, we can't get around this, because I really believe, and I think your experience and anyone that listens to this would probably jive with the same thread of thought, which is freedom is actually fulfillment. It's not freedom to aimlessly move around in the world and have no responsibilities. I think we've hit that point a few times. It's actually freedom to feel fulfilled. And as long as we are doing what's fulfilling to us, we are increasing the freedom in our life.
Ronnie, I want to jump in because you said something that I thought was interesting. You said free to be yourself, right? And I think this is super interesting because so many of us, this idea is like, we're ourselves, right? Like I shouldn't have to work or implement a structure to be myself. I mean, being myself should be easy. I think that's where we need to start asking, how can we be our best selves? Because again, I'm happy to use myself as the personal example here. I don't feel like my best self, or I don't feel free to be myself unless I do my yoga in the morning, right? I do my meditation, I do my Kriya, whatever it is I'm working on. I get really connected to my spiritual practice. Ideally, I do cardio as well. And I get to journal and share and, kind of start my morning in a very specific way. And when I do those things, then I feel like myself. So it's funny because I've always had all this admiration for people who can just wake up and be themselves and don't need to do this whole rigmarole. Because my experience has always been that I actually really need that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's an incredible observation. There's a lot of different interesting thoughts I have about that. But one of the things that came up for me as you were mentioning that was sometimes we have to get to know ourselves. Not, there's a lot of different thought beliefs around this kind of conversation, but my experience has taught me that I'm continually unfolding all the time. I'm an unfolding possibility all the time. That's life. That's the journey of life, is getting to know ourselves, getting to know our soul recognition through the interface of the world that we live in, our own experience. So for me, the times that I've gotten to know myself at the deepest level and to know what I'm made of and to know who's really behind the windows looking back at me in the mirror is when I have to do things I don't want to do. And that's not to say that I'm not enjoying it. I didn't always want to get up at 4:30 in the morning and go work out, but it felt authentic. It felt in alignment. It felt like the right thing to do. Sleeping in did not feel like the right thing to do. It made me feel lazy and lethargic and like I was not choosing my goal. I was choosing to pass on pursuing my goal to be comfortable. And for me, that just doesn't feel like the right thing to do. So I'm getting to know myself through this process of disciplining myself, because it's teaching me about myself. For some people, they might do that and they might find, you know what, this just doesn't feel like me. I don't feel it. It doesn't feel right to forego sleep and get up at 4:30 in the morning. It feels right to wake up at 7 or 8, and that's totally fine because there's chronobiology, there's chronotypes, and different people have different circadian rhythms and different sleep cycles and different metabolisms and different constitutions and temperaments. So it's really important in this process that everyone takes a lot of this conversation and filters it through their own proclivity, because everybody is different, everyone's unique, and you hit the main point, which I think is the most relevant thing, which is you need to find out how to design your life so you can be free to be you. Most people that work a job are not free to be them because it requires them to put on some kind of personality or ego construct in order to show up a particular way that is deemed appropriate. So for most people, or for a lot of people, I should say, that wouldn't work. So they turn to entrepreneurialism or sales or something that allows them the freedom to them. For me, waking up early in the morning and writing, that feels authentic. That feels like me. so I discipline myself. Let me say it this way. I'll conclude this thread of thought on this because I think this is really an interesting point. The discipline comes because we're disciplining ourselves to become more and more of who we really are at the next stage of our evolution. And when we lack discipline, we regress to the lower level stages of our previous self. So we're always on this growth edge. We're always on this evolutionary ladder. And the discipline to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations is that turbulence, that resistance that we go through as we ascend up the rungs of our own evolution. And that's why discipline is so important, because we're disciplining ourselves to be committed to our own growth and our own transformation. But if we lack the discipline, then we are going to defer to who we've been opposed to who we're becoming.
I love that. I think it's so brilliant what you're sharing and so well put. So thank you so much for sharing. And this is my big last question for you before we wrap up is, I'm just thinking of the best way to phrase this question. So say we're really committed to our evolution, as you put it, right? We have a great structure in place. The structure's been working, right? We're getting up early every morning, whatever it is. We'll just stick with that example. Obviously, listeners, there's so many different ways you can create this in your life that involves sleeping in, right? So it's different for each of us. But just going with that example, keeping in mind that we're constantly changing. We're this unfolding possibility, as you put it. All of a sudden, one morning, you start to feel a little different. Like you really don't want to, say, get to your yoga mat. Or you feel like you maybe have a little bit of a cold coming on. And all of a sudden, there's this question inside you. It's like, am I really sick? Do I need to rest? Or is something shifting? Do I really need to kind of change the routine? Or is this just like excuse-itis and I need to kind of be hard on myself and get out of bed? I think, again, it's all about knowing ourselves, right? And I always think of it as, again, like parenting myself. Like, is my kid faking that he's sick for school, or is he really sick for school, you know? But I feel like that's the other huge question that I know I get asked so much. I'm wondering if you do too. What are your thoughts on this? It's like, how do you know if your excuse might be legitimate?
Right. Well, this is an interesting thing because the human psyche is a complicated thing, and this requires a self-investigation into your own psychology. And this is where the personal development work and the self-reflection and self-honesty is so important, because it could be very easy to tell ourselves a lie because our parents may have had a parental fantasy about how our life should have been because they were trying to live vicariously through us. And we actually, there's in psychology, there's projection and there's introjection. So introjection is where we internally project upon ourselves. Projection is where we project something inside of us outwardly to disown or to kind of pretend it's not a part of us. So we get agitated at the world around us. But introjection is where we actually take on the projections of the world, and then we create an identity. We build a part of our identity around that. So that part has to be really understood. And that's where being honest with oneself is so important. And I think the distinction to the question here, it's an interesting one because it's not always straightforward. It's easy for me to say, like, you just got to be honest with yourself. But so many people have spent their entire life being dishonest with themselves that this can be a bit of a tricky thing. So I think the easiest thing for me to say is that I think it comes down to what we were talking about before, which is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because oftentimes the truth is uncomfortable. But I want to encourage people to stay away from unnecessary judgment and being too hard on themselves, because that can be very easy. And it's a very good indicator that if you're being very judgmental of yourself and you're kind of beating yourself up, that is not authentic. That is telling you that you're trying to force something. So the paradox of this too is that I'm not telling people to force themselves into a box or force a habit or activity. You should want to do it. That's the only way anything is going to stick. If you want to implement green vegetable juicing into your lifestyle, for example, at some point you got to enjoy it. Like, you got to want to actually do that. You may not want to do it at first because you haven't had the experience and you haven't experienced the benefits of it and how good you feel when you do it and how you'd rather do that than the soda or the other thing, the energy drinks, and how much better you feel in your body. It takes a little bit of time of practicing the habit in order for it to become obvious. And once it becomes obvious, then you just have to revisit every time you fall off the wagon, so to speak. But I want to make sure that I answer your direct question, because I can go into tangentials. I like to hopscotch from one thought to another. But hopefully that's helpful. If you need further distinction as far as your question goes.
No, I think it's not, there's no easy answer, right? It really is about doing that self-investigation, that self-work, and really kind of knowing yourself and your traits and your history to kind of know how you like to trick yourself or maybe self-sabotage yourself, and figuring that out. And then you can hopefully be more discerning, right? When maybe there's really a time where you need to change the routine or get up later or reassess, and when you're just kind of, making those excuses. So
one thing just came to me as just a practical thing everybody can do. When you are posed with a little bit of a fork in the road, let's say, and you're energetically, and you're like, I don't know should I be hard on myself? Should I just push myself, or should I really relax? It's not always simple. So one thing I would recommend, if you feel confused, put your right hand on your heart, or maybe put both hands on your heart. Breathe into your heart. Focus your respiratory capacity and oxygen into your physical heart. Listen for the answer. You can just ask the question, which direction or which choice is in my highest alignment, or is most authentic, or is going to help me get to where I want to be? And really and try to take all the mental energy and reroute it all into your physical heart, because that'll activate your metaphorical sacred heart, and that's where your soul communicates to you. So if you're ever in that particular situation, I always defer to soul intelligence. It's a practice. It's another discipline. It's like meditation. It's like it takes practice, but if you can keep doing that, you'll get the answer you need.
I love that. That is such a great tip. Ronnie, thank you so much. We've talked about such a wide range of things, and your expertise has shed so much light. I'm so glad that you came on the show. And listeners, I have fantastic news, because Ronnie's joining us again later this week. So for Thursday's episode, he and I are going to continue this conversation. We're going to start chatting about how you can recreate your own life so you're really the hero of your own story. I'm really excited to share kind of the part 2 of this episode. So make sure to tune in on Thursday. And we've talked about meditation a couple times throughout this episode. I really also want to share that whether you're an avid meditator or looking to get started with meditation, visit savanaspirit.com, because they have everything you need to enhance your meditation practice at home, whether it's mala beads, singing bowls, statues, incense. And when you do this, you're supporting the podcast. So use discount code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. 2 ways you can support the podcast: savanaspirit.com, and of course, always leaving your ratings and reviews here on iTunes. They mean the world for me, and I really genuinely appreciate your feedback so we can make the show everything you want it to be. Ronnie, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we will all reconvene on Thursday. So much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/SivanaSpirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.
So ultimately, the greatest choice you can make every single day is to bestow genius upon yourself and to reroute any habits and any tendencies that you have to wallow or self-inflicted mediocrity and keep changing the patterns towards activating genius, activating self-responsibility, activating heroic, courageous qualities.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back. Thank you for all the love and support you give the show. Today, we're continuing our full conversation with Ronnie Landis. He's an expert in holistic health and human potential. His work ranges from exploring the fringe of cutting-edge health science to a deep passion for helping people overcome long-held mental and emotional roadblocks so they can experience every area of their life at their full potential. He's also a public speaker and a published author of multiple books. We had an absolutely fantastic conversation with him on Tuesday's show, all about how discipline is actually freedom. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I really highly encourage you to check it out. And today we're continuing the conversation with a little bit of a different twist. We're going to be talking about the hero's journey. Some of you may be familiar with it, but Ronnie's going to walk us through step by step and explain to us how understanding Joseph Campbell's hero's journey can serve as a powerful catalyst for change in our own life. He's going to cover key plot points on the hero's journey and then share with us how we can use this as a framework to really further our own self-development. Before we dive in, I just want to remind you to show your support for the show through a rating or review here on iTunes. It's really one of the best ways you can give back and help get the podcast in front of more people looking to transform their life through yoga and meditation. I'm also encouraging any of you who meditate to enhance your practice by purchasing something on SivanaSpirit.com, whether it's some mala beads or a singing bowl, statues, or incense. You can make a purchase at SivanaSpirit.com and support the podcast and also enhance your meditation practice. So it's a win-win. And I even have that special coupon code for you, podcast30, for 30% off your first order at SivanaSpirit.com, so you can get anything your heart desires. All right, now let's dive into this week's episode. Today, we're continuing the conversation, but taking it down a slightly different path. We're going to talk about how we can rewrite our stories and how we can become the hero in our own story. Ronnie, why is this something that we should consider doing? Because, I think a lot of us were like, what? There's a story about our life that I'm telling myself all the time? Well, what's going on? Is that true?
It's 100% true. When you really look at reality, whether you look at it from a quantum physics perspective, you look at it from a semi-religious or spiritual perspective or mystic perspective, one has to admit to themselves that there are certain patterns and themes and archetypical themes going on in the nature of reality. And all you have to do is just look back at you have to reflect back on the movie reel of your life. And you don't have to do it for very long to realize that there's certain patterns and themes that are synchronistically aligned, almost sequentially taking us from one stage of maturation to another. Starting from our formative year, you're a child, and we're in a dependency state on our biological or paternal guides, and then we're developing into a self-directed being, an adult. We've gone through certain phases and certain stages of growth that are universal to the human condition. And so when we think about this, I think of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is one of the absolutely most important, the most essential mythic representations, I guess, or stories, that's not the right word. Themes is the word I'm looking for. It's one of the most important mythic themes that we all need to understand about the nature of reality, because one of the things I found so interesting many, many years ago when I was studying psychology and philosophy and mythology, I came across the work of Joseph Campbell. And most people at this point have heard of Joseph Campbell. He's the one who really brought to bear this idea of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is basically a mythic and archetypical framework for the story that each one of us goes on in our life. And what I found really interesting is that every single Hollywood motion picture, every single successful movie that's ever been made follows the exact same formula. And the formula is the hero's journey. So the most iconic movies we can think of are movies like Star Wars, Avatar. You can throw out some other really amazing ones, but every single movie, The Matrix obviously is a pretty profound one. Every single major movie that captures us, that captivates us, that transfixes us, that we feel a relationship with the characters. The reason why we feel related to through those characters' journey is because on a certain level, they are reflecting back to us the micro situations or the micro themes that we go through in our own life. Choosing courage over cowardice, choosing compassion over anger, making difficult decisions in our life when we're posed with a moral or ethical conflict, these kind of things. The reason why we resonate so much with the movies is because it's actually drawing something intrinsic to the human journey. And that human journey is the hero's journey. And, I'll end that thought on that note. But there are some interesting themes that I would love to unpack for everyone listening about the hero's journey, because it's not as simple as just say, oh, we're on a hero's journey. There is a science that's been unveiled about what the hero's journey is in the chronological order, that the stages of maturation that every single one of us go through. And I think once we really go through that, people listening to this are going to get some really, really incredible aha moments.
Okay, great. This is exciting. So do you want to unpack, as you say, some of these main plot points in the journey for us?
Absolutely. I think that'd be a great place to start. And then we can go into, how do you actually redesign your life? And ultimately, how do you become the hero in your own journey? And the journey is the life that you're living. So yeah, I'd love to start by just going through some of the plot points. So the way Joseph Campbell came to this, he basically outlined it with three major themes, and then there's a lot of other plot points which we will lay out. There's about 12 stages of the hero's journey, and the three pivotal stages are the separation, the initiation, and then the return. So the separation is where the hero or the protagonist, the main character, is basically living in an ordinary world. The ordinary world is where, let's say, if you take Luke Skywalker in the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, Luke Skywalker was a reluctant farmer. He was, I can't remember if that was I think it was his aunt and uncle that he was living with, and he was basically working on the farm. But there was this call to adventure inside of him, but he was challenged by his kind of external obligation to work the farm, but that wasn't authentic to him. There was something calling him to go on a great adventure. And so an event had to happen that caused a separation, basically where there was a burning of the bridge from the ordinary world that the hero, the protagonist in the story, was used to, and they had to leave their familiar surroundings, go on what is the second stage is the call to adventure. So the first stage is the ordinary world. They're just living ordinary life as it has been. Then there's a call to adventure. And in the call to adventure, the hero's adventure begins when he or she receives call to action. There's something that happens. There's something that calls them to take action in a radically different direction. In Luke Skywalker's case, there was, his uncle and aunt's house was attacked by stormtroopers, and there was nothing, literally, he could not go back. So he had to move forward. And then stage 3, and the plot points here is so interesting how this has been completely scientifically mapped out. Stage 3 is the refusal of the call. So we think of the reluctant hero. There is a heroic quality, and this individual is about to go on the call to adventure, but there's a refusal to go because there's fear. There's some kind of intrinsic or primordial that comes up: doubt, concern, worry. worrying about what other people are going to think or the what ifs. When we're faced with a particular situation that is going to take us out of our familiar circumstance, let's say we're going to leave a job, we're going to leave a relationship, whatever the case may be, there is a fear that comes up that tries to hold us to what's familiar. And so that's the refusal of the call. And following that, the fourth stage is meeting the mentor. So at this crucial turning point, the hero desperately needs guidance where he or she meets a mentor figure who gives them something they need to take the next step in their journey. So somebody shows up in our life, whether it's metaphorical or it is physical, a physical mentor that can help us. That could be a coach, that could be a yoga instructor, that could be a fitness coach, that could be a business mentor, whatever have you. Somebody shows up in our life to help guide us to the next stage. And then the next stage in the plot is crossing the threshold. So at this point, the hero is now ready to act upon their call to adventure and now really begin their quest. So whatever the call is, whatever was holding them back, they're now ready to move forward. And then the next stage is the initiation. So this is the major plot turning point, is the initiation. They are now initiated into becoming the hero. And so this is where they meet up against tests and antagonists. So in any good movie, there's a protagonist, which is the hero, and then there's antagonist, which is the villain or the oppositional figure. So in Star Wars, Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's opposite. It's always the direct opposite of the protagonist. So it's like the shadow element. In Jungian psychology, it would be the shadow element of the light side, the light and dark side of the force, for example. You can also look at that as the fear if you want to take that practically in your own life, because not all of us don't have a Darth Vader or an exaggerated villain or antagonist. Let's call that fear, because ultimately what the antagonist represents is the repressed unconscious fears inside of the hero. If you think of Batman's ultimate antagonist was the character of Joker, which represented basically chaos, where Batman was trying to instill order. So you have to kind of look at it symbolically too, because the symbolism plays out in our own life. And the initiation into the next stage, which is called approaching the innermost. This is the scene in the second Star Wars movie where Luke Skywalker is being mentored by Yoda, and Luke goes into the cave, and there's this phantom figure of Darth Vader that shows up. It's not really Darth Vader, but it's a projection of his own subconscious. And when he hits Darth Vader, the phantom figure with the lightsaber, Darth Vader's mask blows off, and it shows Luke Skywalker's face. And the symbolism of that is that the thing Luke Skywalker feared or resistance was himself. It was the fear inside of himself his own fear, to confront what had been there his whole life. And in this, we find out that Darth Vader is actually his father, and we kind of get that whole plot twist. But ultimately, there's a point in the hero's journey where the hero has to become initiated by facing their deepest, by going into the cave of their own subconscious, where they've been reluctant to go into because of the threat of danger or ego death. The dark night of the soul is an interesting thing here, because when somebody is reluctant to face something or to confront some kind of resistance in their life, it continues to show up, and it continues to manifest and reflect in the external reality, and it continues to trigger something inside of us until we assume the courage to face our fear. So that's number 7 along this initiation point, which is approaching the innermost cave. The next point is the ordeal. And so the ordeal is it's explained as the supreme ordeal, which may be a dangerous physical test or a deep inner crisis that the hero must face in order to survive, or for the world in which the hero lives to continue to exist. So whether it be facing his or her greatest fear or most deadliest foe, in a more Hollywood movie sense, hero must draw upon all of his or her skills and their experiences gathered upon the path while they were facing what they had to face, their biggest conflict in the cave, in order to overcome their most difficult challenge. So the ordeal can be looked at as that situation that we avoid, but we're also kind of excited about, right? Like, this is an interesting point when we're thinking about pursuing our dream, pursuing our passion, starting that business, starting that whatever that thing inside of us that calls us to grow and transform ourselves. There's typically a bit of hesitation and there's a bit of excitement that go along with it. And that's how you know you are on the right path and you're actually confronting the thing inside of you that's going to cause the greatest transformation, because fear and excitement at the same time, they're dancing together. They're interwoven together in the same sensory system. You feel those things together. Only through some form of death can the hero be reborn. So this is like a metaphorical resurrection, if you will. Essentially, what the ordeal does is it helps us die to who we once were and to what we've held on to, the expectations, the assumptions, the belief systems, the old habits that don't serve us, et cetera, et cetera. Those things have to die or be recycled in order for the hero in us to rise, to emerge out like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And then on the next stage is the reward. And in alchemical terms or Arthurian terms, the King Arthur, the story of King Arthur, it's seizing the sword, or in alchemical terms, it is discovering the philosopher's stone, the immortal elixir. So after defeating the enemy, the metaphorical enemy, of course, it's the fear that lives inside of us, surviving death or ego death, finally overcoming their greatest personal challenge, hero is ultimately transformed into a new state, emerging from the battle as a stronger and wiser individual, and they have the prize. And the prize in these stories is usually some kind of like they go on a quest and they get the treasure and they bring it back. But really the treasure is the person you become, right? That's the ultimate metaphor here. And symbolism is who you become is the reward for the journey. And the next stage is the road back. It's the return. So now the hero has gone on their journey. They have become reinvented because of everything they've had to go through. They've been resurrected. They've been reborn. And now they return back to where they came to bring the treasure or bring the elixir or bring the sword or whatever the symbol is in a particular story. They come back to where they started to bring back the wisdom that they gained from their journey. And that in essence is the chronology, the chronological order of the stages that Joseph Campbell worked out in the hero's journey. And he came to this whole thing because he realized that he was a student of mythology, and he realized that every single myth, every single mythological tale, whether it's Hercules or it's the great Roman or Greek mythologies or Asian mythologies or Western mythologies, every single one of them built within the storyline had this exact order of events that took place that he called the hero's journey.
I love you sharing this because I think me and maybe many listeners have read or heard about it in the past, but it's so fun to hear you outline it piece by piece. I guess my next question is, how does this relate, or how are you working with people to help them make sense of this or figure out where they are in this journey in order to help fuel their self-development, to help maybe fuel their spiritual practice?
Yeah. Well, it's one thing to explain the process or to watch a movie and get it, because that's being projected to us. So then it has to be internally kind of understood or reflected through our life experience. One of the things I encourage people to do is to actually go back through the movie reel of their own life and start from the beginning and start to reflect or meditate upon how these themes are playing out in their own life. Because typically when this is explained to somebody, there's a lot of aha moments that happen. Because what's interesting about mythology and archetypes is that it teaches us something that we already know. What I mean by that is when somebody watches a great movie that is archetypically embedded, it has all these symbolisms and archetypes that are intrinsic to the universal human journey. They'll have that look when your eyes get wide and open. You're kind of like, whoa, you resonate on a very congruent level with what a speaker is saying or what you're seeing in a movie or something. The reason is because you are realizing something that is intrinsic to you. It's like, on a soul level that what you're seeing or what you're hearing is absolute, unrefutable truth to your life experience, but you've never heard it in that way before. You've never ruminated on it. You've never thought about it. You've never actually looked at it before. But the moment you recognize it, the moment it is reflected back to you, an entire teaching is given to you. And it's hard to actually teach that kind of thing without somebody having that experience, which is why movies are so great for this. This is why, Star Wars is probably the most iconic movie series in the history of cinema, because it's so brilliantly outlaid what I think is so paramount and intrinsic to the human condition. So really for me, it's about helping walk somebody through their own life experience and help them see what they couldn't see before. And if you notice, I don't know if you're a big book reader, but it's kind of like where you read a book like The Alchemist from Paulo Coelho or Dan Millman's The Peaceful Warrior, brilliant books like that, which are total hero's journey stories. And you read it once and it's amazing, right? Then you put it down. A couple years later, you read it again, and it's like the book didn't change, but you changed between the first time you read it and now reading it, and you see it completely different. And then you put it down, and years later you pick it back up, and it's a completely different book because you're becoming a completely different person. So there is a process where you have to keep looking back at certain events in your life because you're a different person looking at them. Therefore, they are going to be interpreted a little bit differently. And there's a point in time where we have reconciled all our past conflicts, our past wounds or traumas. We've healed all that stuff. And once we've done that, we now are ready to move forward with reinventing our life, or I should say, creating the life we want, because now we understand that we are the center point in our life. We are the common denominator in our life. We can take full responsibility for everything in our life because we are donning the position of the hero in our own story.
Wow, it's a lot. It's a lot here. It's exciting. I want to make sure we pull out some practical action steps for the listeners in all of this. What is the opposite of being the hero in your own story? Is it like that victim mindset or thinking that life is sort of being done to you? What do you find with clients?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So if let's just keep it archetypical for a second, because if you look at the protagonist and the antagonist, the distinction is, from a psychological perspective, the clear distinction is that the hero and the villain, they both went through a journey to become who they were. The only difference is at some point in the journey, one of the characters decided to take full responsibility for their life. And that's a very heroic quality, to take responsibility for your life. And the other character decided that they were a victim, that something was happening to them, and that they were not going to take responsibility for it, and they were going to actually rebel against the world or against the people that imposed upon them. Right? They were victimized, so they took the other route and actually became the villain. That's classically how the villain is created. It's not usually somebody that born malicious or evil or anything. It's actually somebody that's deeply wounded and chose that life. They were at the effect of life, so they were going to make a power play and become the archetypical villain. And that's typically how those two paths diverge. So ultimately, the opposite of the hero is the victim, and where we actually can't take responsibility for anything in our life. Therefore, we either become a disempowered victim or an empowered victim. The empowered victim is like the control complex, where somebody is like hyper controlling. They're trying to control everything because they don't actually trust in themselves, which is why they can't take responsibility, or they don't trust that life is guiding them naturally towards where they need to be. So ultimately, there's a power control, or the disempowered victim is somebody that feels powerless, and they just become kind of a vagabond in life, and they don't have any goals, and they're kind of aimless, and there's no discipline. And so they just kind of get thrown around life, and they become the victim of the controllers. That kind of gets, that's a whole psychological, deep dive. But I just want to make that kind of distinction so people can understand symbolically and psychologically how this happens. And if you find yourself in any one of those victim states, or maybe, hey, I'm being a little too controlling, or I feel like I have no control, you can migrate into the heroic side of things by letting go of needing to control, or knowing that you have more control than you think. And all you have to do is take more responsibility for your life. And we can go into, if you want to go into a little more practicality in terms of like what people can do, that's pretty easy. But I wanted to kind of give this landscape so people have a psychological reference.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the victim having these two different modes, kind of the mode of wanting to control too much or feeling like so victimized, like they have no control. That's an interesting distinction that I don't think I've heard before. So I'd love to hear you talk about that more if you feel called. And then, yes, I'd love some practical steps for people who are listening to this and maybe they're unhappy with their job, or they have a problem right now in a relationship, and they take whatever they're going through, hang it on this framework, and then have some insights.
Right. Well, a deeper truth, I think, is to realize that every single situation that we find ourselves in, except, in the formative years, the things that we can't control, because when we're from age 1 to 2 to 3, maybe even 4, we are dependent. We are physiologically and emotionally and actually entirely dependent on the care of our caretaker. That's why failure to thrive syndrome is, it's a real thing. A baby actually needs love as a primary nutrient and needs to be taken care of. And if they don't receive love and they don't receive affection, they don't receive care, they will fail to thrive, and it actually can be developmentally damaging and life-threatening for an infant. So we got to keep that in mind. But once we've gone past those dependent stages, ultimately everything in our life is happening because of a choice or the lack of a choice that we've made at some point. So if somebody is let's say they're in a relationship that they really don't want to be in, and it's total conflict, and I know how that feels. And I know how hard it can be to assume total responsibility. But if you track back the movie reel, again, this all comes back to reflecting on the sequence of events that led to something happening. Usually somebody is in a particular situation because they did not their own personal demon. They didn't confront a conversation. They didn't confront a decision that they didn't want to make. They didn't confront the fact that at some point their intuition or their conscious was trying to tell them to hey dude, look at this, hey, take a look at this, but they medicated, they suppressed it, they bypassed it, whatever the case was. They didn't confront it. And that, if you remember what we were talking about in the stages of the hero's journey, there's a stage where the hero must confront their deepest fear. And I find that people will find themselves in disturbing situations, conflicting situations, because they bypass the ordeal phase of the journey and they're stuck in a pleasure-pain cycle. And so they'll do anything to avoid pain and receive pleasure. And as long as somebody is in that cycle, they're going to continue to bypass that fundamental point of transformation, which is confronting their greatest fear. And so, that's a whole thing of itself. I don't think I have to go too much deeper into that particular point. I think somebody can discern where that relates to them in their personal hero's journey.
Right. And in where in the journey they might be personally stuck. For example, you talked about that call to adventure, that call to take action. And I think a lot of people are maybe in denial, right? Like they really want to be, who knows, right? An artist, a scuba instructor, right? But they're in denial that they want that, or they think that can't be true for them. They have to stay at whatever, current job or office reality is for them right now, right? Or perhaps meeting a mentor too, right? I mean, sometimes people just haven't found that teacher, or haven't, maybe because they're not asking or seeking or inviting in the energy of finding the right teacher or finding that mentor who's going to really help them get to the next level of where they need to go. Am I kind of on the right track here?
You're absolutely, I mean, you get it. Like you understand, this is common sense, common archetypical sense. We weren't raised understanding mythology or archetypes or symbolism. So, a lot of us are symbolically illiterate. That's why this is kind of a re-education into the nature of reality and how things, storyline of reality, the cosmic storyline is actually playing out. And by the way, this hero's journey repeats itself. This is an important thing to understand. It's not just one big journey and then it's done. It repeats itself over and over. The patterns are the same. The chronological order, the phases are the same, but it repeats itself from one hero's journey to another hero's journey.
And say more about that. What does that mean? Like different, once we get to one level or make some change in our life, there's always more that we need to work on, kind of thing?
You can look at it like work on. I just look at it like an adventure. There's just a new adventure. There's the next adventure. Like look in your life. Like I guarantee yoga and doing the work you do in the yoga field isn't I would even say, like, think of it this way. When you start, I don't know your life experience, but I can assume that when you started your yoga journey, it was a particular adventure in of itself. And then once you made it through that particular cycle, a new adventure kicked in. Like this podcast may have been its own adventure or a part of a bigger adventure in of itself. So there's different calls to adventure that happen. And each one of them calls us to face a bigger point of resistance.
Different fears we have, for example.
Because ultimately, it's just an adventure to transform. That's what the adventure is. It's a call to transformation.
I like what you're saying. It's like we're not one Star Wars movie. We're like 80 Star Wars movies over the course of our lifetime. So tell me about some of these additional practical tips you wanted to share with listeners about this whole philosophy and concept. I think it's really fun.
Okay, cool. So one of the things I think would be really helpful for people is to take this whole concept, take this whole idea, and then think of your life as it stands as an adventure. Your life, you are the hero in your journey. Now it's one thing to say that, but you're going to get amnesia when you wake up. You go to sleep, you wake up, you're going to be back in your life. We're going to have spiritual amnesia. We need things that actually are consistent reference points that remind us about what we've committed to. That's why we have a schedule, because it reminds us that we committed to going to work out in the morning or going to yoga or going to whatever, doing whatever the thing is, right? So we need to have that when we're reinventing our sense of self. One of the things I think is helpful is it's a two-step process. One of the things is, the first step is, I would encourage somebody to think of the top 5 people, whether they're mythic. I would say it in this sense. The top 5 people, whether they're alive, they're personal heroes of yours, they're iconic figures that you're inspired by, like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Mother Teresa or something, or those would be people that have passed on. So those would be iconic people that have passed on, or you can think of people that are still alive today. It doesn't matter. What we're looking for, it's not about the person, it's about what they represent and symbolize to you. Because when you see somebody that you're inspired by and you resonate with, ultimately that's telling you something about what you're inspired by inside yourself. And that's the call. That's the hero's journey in of itself, is that we're not looking to idolize other people. We're looking to recognize that intrinsic inspirational quality inside somebody else that's reflecting back to us about our own genius, about our own capability to in this context, to take our hero's journey, right? To do something great and contribute to the world. So that's the first thing. I would say identify the top 5 people and then start to identify 10 or 20 character traits within each one of those people that you are most inspired by, that you feel relative to yourself. You may not be able to see that in yourself right away. It takes time. But I would say take 10 quality traits that you admire the most in each one of those characters. You can do this on a whiteboard. You can put it on your wall. Get a standing whiteboard or just journal in your notebook. And then once you do that, I want you to look at all those qualities, and I want you to honestly look inside yourself and identify where inside yourself each one of those qualities exists. This is the first part. And then once you've done that and you can actually see that you contain all those qualities that you admire inside yourself, now the second part is to actually reinvent yourself from the awareness that you have all the qualities you admire in other people. They exist inside of you right then, right now, and forever. And now from that place of awareness, you can actually create the life that you want to live and be the person that you want to be. Be the hero in your own journey. And then the second part is really just like, it's almost like goal orientated, but it's not about achieving a goal. It's about becoming the person that you want to become. And it's one thing, the reason I have people do this quality admiration kind of checklist, if you want to think of it that way, is because it triggers something inside of them that they can't talk themselves out of, right? It catalyzes a transformative process. And it balances their mind so they can't actually disown the good qualities inside themselves. They can't project that onto someone else as if someone else has it and they don't have it. So they can't talk themselves out of being the hero in their own journey. They actually have to assume total responsibility, but not because they told themselves to, but because it came alive inside them. So that to me is one of the most powerful processes I usually walk a lot of my clients through.
I love that. Very exciting journaling exercise, I think, for me and others listening. Were there any other tips like that or practical exercises you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
I think that there's a lot of things that can be said. I mean, I would just say, like, make sure that you take care of yourself. Take absolutely good care of yourself, because in order to be the hero in your own journey, you have to treat yourself like the hero in your own journey. So, you gotta think loving thoughts. You gotta have a meditation practice or some kind of reflective practice where you can reflect on what's the mission for today? What's the adventure for today? What do I need to do today? Because every hero has a mission. So you want to think in terms of, what is my mission for today? What is my call to action for today? What am I committed to today? Okay, awesome. So you got to think good thoughts. And then you want to be in a place of physical vitality where you got to treat yourself like a holy temple, right? It's one thing to go to church and to go to that form of holy temple, but your physical body is your holy temple. That's what they teach in yoga and many other sacred practices. So you don't want to desecrate your holy temple and treat it like a garbage bin. You've got to put in the right kind of fuel. And from my perspective, that would be all organic, high plant-based nutrition. So you stay light on your feet, your digestion is flowing, your brain is functioning optimally. You're in a high alkaline state, and you're feeling good. You're not weighed down by aches, pains, and chronic joint issues and digestive infections and things of that nature. You got to take care of the physical vessel through movement practice and through good nutrition, good sleep, meditation, and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, I feel like we've covered an incredible landscape, and from this point on, it's really just kind of common sense activities, stuff that I'm sure you talk about in your podcast a lot, stuff that I talk about in all of my work. It really comes down to self-love at the end of the day. It's like, there's a great quote that I'll end this thought thread on, which comes from one of my great mentors, his name's Walter Russell. He's long gone, but he was one of the great mystics of Western civilization. And he had a quote that says, mediocrity is self-inflicted, genius is self-bestowed. So ultimately, the greatest choice you can make every single day is to bestow genius upon yourself and to reroute any habits and any tendencies that you have to wallow in self-inflicted mediocrity, and keep changing the patterns towards activating genius, activating self-responsibility, activating heroic, courageous qualities.
Keep going on those adventures, right? Keep going on Star Wars adventure after Star Wars movie adventure in your own life, right?
Keep making those courageous choices to go on the call of adventure, and life will be the greatest laboratory. Your life will be your laboratory. It will teach you everything you need to know.
Ronnie, it's been so fun chatting with you and having you on the show. How can listeners connect with you? What's the best place to find you online?
Yeah, so people can go to my website, which is www.ronnielandis.net. I have another website, which is www.holistichealthmastery.com, which is my holistic nutrition certification program. And funny enough, we didn't touch on nutrition at all, but just so everyone knows, the last decade, my work in the world has been focused on holistic health, integrative and natural nutrition, alternative healing. And I have a holistic nutrition certification program called the Holistic Health Mastery Program. People can check out. It's an online course. And then, like I said, they can go to my other website, ronnielandis.net, to see all the other content that I put out there, and my podcast, the Holistic Human Optimization Show, which touches on all kinds of subjects related to holistic human optimization, just becoming the best version of yourself in every area of life.
Well, so many thanks for sharing your time and your knowledge on behalf of me and all of our listeners. You've been so generous with your tips and your thoughts, so I'm so grateful that you came on the show. Thank you so much for being here. And Sivana listeners, thank you for your encouragement and your feedback and for listening all the way to the very end. As you know, there's two big ways that you can support the show. One is by leaving a rating or review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't normally how you listen to the show. In doing this, you really help get this information in front of more people, help more people find the podcast so that they too can transform their lives through yoga and meditation. And the second way is to treat yourself to something at savanaspirit.com. If you're into meditation, which Ronnie and I have talked about a bunch this week, Sivana has everything you need to enhance your meditation practice, from mala beads to singing bowls to statues to incense, cushions, everything you need to truly make your space sacred. And you can use the discount code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. So much love. I hope you take some time this week to journal, think about your own hero's journey, and find some time to reflect on everything we learned this week. I'm sending you so much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/SivanaSpirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at sivanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode. And thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.